In today's episode, we have the pleasure of welcoming Pete Sheinbaum, a distinguished figure renowned for his extensive experience as a serial entrepreneur, investor, and mentor. With a proven track record in scaling businesses, Pete brings invaluable insights and expertise to our discussion.
For better or for worse, if I had a dream or there's something I wanted to go after, it's going to be on me. I was kind of at the end of my rope. I really thought this thing was about to fail completely. I decided that I needed to recreate myself. One of the most important things that I learned early in my career was it's really good to find out what you want to do with your career. It's also really good to find out what you don't want to do with your career. And the sooner that people can figure out what they love and what they don't love, the path becomes more clear for them.
I'm curious how you define success. Before we dive into today's episode, designed to inspire your journey towards success, happiness, and fulfillment, I have a small favor to ask of you. Please take a moment to hit that subscribe button. My goal is to continue bringing you insightful and helpful content that will foster your personal and professional growth. I'm so thrilled to have you on this journey with me, and I deeply appreciate your support. Pete, can you share your journey in life and business? And you can start from childhood, what influenced you to get into entrepreneurship, or just anything that has really shaped you both professionally and personally to get to where you are now.
Sure. Kind of where do I start? So, I grew up on the East Coast to a couple hardworking families. They were not entrepreneurs. They were a banker and a writer, editor in a newspaper. It was the 80s, I guess, when I was growing up, if you count from 10 to 20-ish as the real formative years. And interestingly, my dad was a very, very smart guy. He was kind of Mensa smart and was curious about things. He bought a computer when the first computer, I think, came out. I think it was an Apple IIe back in, I don't know when it was, 85, 84, probably when War Games, the movie, came out with Matthew Broderick, and was fascinated by it. And he plopped it in front of me and said, I don't know how this thing works, but let's play with this and put it together. That ended up being part of my career as far as technology, but it was more about, looking at something new and seeing how it worked and trying to figure out how to make it work if it didn't work. And he wasn't super handy, around the house. He was hardworking. But I really got into the whole, let's tear this thing apart and put it back together and hopefully it still works. And I didn't do that to the level of most engineers, but I did it enough to break it a couple times and have to go back to the store and have them help me put it back together. Anyway, studied at Colgate University, economics and philosophy. So I'm not sure if those go hand in hand, but it was one of those things that just kind of stuck. And decided that, I wanted to get into something related to business, but didn't really know how and when that was going to be. My mom, after I'd been at college for a couple of months, our first Thanksgiving, sat me down and said, hey, you were at college for a couple of months now. Have you figured out what you're going to do with the rest of your life? And Colgate's a liberal arts school, so you can kind of do whatever. And I said, yeah, Mom, it's great. I actually have. And she was shocked and surprised, but I guess pleased that I had already found a direction. And she said, what are you going to do? And I said, well, I met these cool guys in this fraternity, and they're going to go to Colorado and go skiing after college. So that's what I'm going to do. And she looked at me and said, yeah. I was like, no, that sounds great. So anyway, another year goes by. Next Thanksgiving, same conversation. It was a little bit of a joke. So you've been there now, a year and a couple months. Now what are you going to do? And I said, told you a year ago that I was going to go skiing, and the guys are still going to go, and so that's what I'm going to do. My dad didn't say a word. He just kind of stared at his food. Third year came by, same conversation. Then the fourth year came by, and all my friends were starting to interview with companies and things, because that's what you do during your senior year in college. And she finally said, okay, so now, do you need a suit? Like what's the interview schedule going to look like? And I said, no, Mom, I told you, I'm not interviewing. I'm going to go out west after I graduate and figure out my life. And she kind of had a stern look on her face, and then she smiled a little bit, and then she stared at me, square in the eye and said, well, if that's what you're going to do, yo-yo. And I said, yo-yo? What do you mean yo-yo? She said, yo-yo. I said, Mom, I don't know what yo-yo means. And she said, you're on your own. So that was really kind of a beginning for me to understand that if I had something, for better or for worse, if I had a dream or there's something I wanted to go after, it's going to be on me, to go out and figure it out myself. And while help obviously is important, it was the kernel has to come from inside, and the drive to do it comes from inside. So I said, great, no problem. I'd run a painting company in town with some people, so I had some work, and anyway, so that was the plan. Fast forward a couple months, and unfortunately my dad passed away during the spring of my senior year, which put a big strain on the family, obviously. I came home for a couple weeks, and then I was planning on, I hadn't graduated yet. My mom sent me back to school and said, you have to graduate. You've been there for 4 years, so come back when you're done. So that happened, and I started up my painting company in the middle of this kind of chaos around my dad's death. And had a couple buddies from college who were living with me and working, and it was good. And I'd originally planned to go out west, like I talked about, and go skiing and figure it out. And I was about to not do that because of my mom, and my sister was around in the area. She's a little bit older. And she basically said, you can't give up on this thing just because this terrible thing happened. You're going to regret it. So I thought about it, and she was right. So off we went. After spending the summer painting, we bought a truck. We drove to Utah, actually, and a buddy of mine from Colgate was riding shotgun, and we walked into a ski lodge up at Alta, Utah, and said, do you need people to work? And they said, yep. And we had a 20-minute interview, and they said, great, but it's July or August. We don't need you till November. So we took off. We drove around the country, lived in the truck for 4 or 5 months, I guess it was, going to every national park and eating rice and beans every night and just kind of experiencing life, my buddy Chris and I. And, I remember that like it was yesterday. It was a terrific experience. So we ended up back in Utah, talked to my mother on the phone, no cell phones back then. So, she's like, well, the skiing thing is great. I'm glad you made it. I'm glad you're enjoying yourself. So what are you going to do with the rest of your life? How are you going to get a job as a ski bum? Because she was a little bit worried because it was so atypical to then most of the kids in our community going out west and skiing. So I said, I'll just meet a guy in a chairlift. We'll hit it off. He'll give me a job, and I'm not so worried about it. So she chuckled and hung up, and that was sort of it. So one day that winter, my boss, because I was serving food in the dining room, came up to me and said, hey, there's a bunch of guys from New York City out here on a trip. And they were on some sort of a boondoggle with customers and things. And I think they work for a bank. And I know you said you studied business or economics or something. You should go talk to them. I made them your table. And I said, well, what am I going to talk to them about? She's like, I don't know. Just figure it out. So during the course of the night, I went up to a guy at the table and said, hey, where are you guys from? And, we started talking, and I think they had a couple drinks in them. So they were a little bit more easy or more interested in talking to me. And I told them my background and where I went to school. And they said, what are you doing out here? I'm like, well, I'm out here because it's amazing. And we're getting 100 or 800 inches of snow this year. And why wouldn't you want to be out here? And I said, but eventually I'm going to have to get a job. And, what do you guys do? And they said they were bankers. They worked for a bank in New York City. And they said, we can help you, but, if you really want a job in New York City, you got to go talk to that guy. Another gentleman was sitting at the table, a little bit off by himself. And I walked up to him and said, I hear you're the guy that I should talk to get a job. And he looked at me and said, who the hell are you? And I said, I'm your waiter. I've been serving you all evening. He's like, well, you're one of the worst waiters that I've ever seen in my entire life. And I said, oh, well, this is not going to go well. So I walked away. And later that night, because after we close up, since there wasn't much to do, we go down in the basement, or the bar in the basement, and was sitting there. And he was sitting there at the bar, and I walked up to him and said, hey, I wanted to apologize if I was a bad server. And he actually decided to talk to me at that point. We chatted for a while. And he's like, you should really come work for me, at the bar. I'm like, oh, that sounds great. I'm not sure what exactly I'd be doing, but I'd be happy to talk to you more about it. Conversation ended. Woke up the next morning. The guy had probably been a little groggy from the night before. Saw him at breakfast and walked up to him and to remind him about our conversation. And I said, so how does this work? And he's like, who are you again? I'm like, oh, I was talking to you at the bar last night and you said I should come work for you and work at the bank. He's like, oh, well, my name's at the front desk and Chemical Bank's on Park Avenue. And he got up and left. And that was it.
Oh my gosh.
So I was a little bit discouraged, but, had it in me to kind of see if this was real or not. So I found his name. I found out where the bank was. I found the phone number. And I started calling. And I called once a week for about 3 weeks asking for this gentleman. Never called me back. And after about a month, maybe 6 weeks, someone else called me back and said, hey, this guy Mark is a busy guy. He's not going to call you back. He asked me to get back in touch. Here's the deal. We're not going to fly you to New York City to interview. That's just a free trip home to see your mom. If you happen to be in New York City, we'll set something up. And then he hung up. So I decided that, this was sort of serendipity or something was going on. I took out a credit card that I didn't have any money on, and I bought a ticket to New York. I went to my house in Connecticut, picked up my bar mitzvah suit, which I probably hadn't worn in 7 years, and I went on to New York to go interview for a job I didn't know anything about at a bank that I didn't know anything about. And got to the interview, and the woman came out and kind of looked me up and down because I was a ski bum from Colorado. I'm sure she wanted to make sure I wasn't wearing shorts. And said, we've got 5 interviews for you, each an hour long, back to back to back. This is out of cycle, so we're not sure where this is going to go, but you were sent by Walter, via Mark, so we're doing something special for you. I still didn't know who the guy was. There was no internet. We didn't have a computer in the lodge. I didn't have a cell phone. So I was sitting waiting for my interview, and I opened up and I looked on the coffee table, and there's an annual report. I opened up the annual report just to kind of flip through it, and the guy's picture is like on the inside cover. He's the vice chairman of the bank. So interestingly, I'm guessing now why he didn't get back to me, but also that he got me an interview. Went to the interviews, and like clockwork, everybody asked what I was doing there. This is not cycle. What's going on? When they asked me what I was doing, I told them I'm actually living in Utah skiing. They all looked at me because these were younger guys, and they said, if I could do it all over again, I would have done that. I went from college to banking. I've been grinding for 3, 4, 5 years, and I wish that I had taken a year off and just kind of explored things before I got into the grind. Anyway, one thing led to another. I didn't hear back from them for a couple months. Had an offer to be a river guide up in Idaho. Was about to leave on that experience because I didn't have a job. And a guy in the lodge was going to go work up there, and he got me some work. And the bank called, and they said, hey, sorry it's taken so long. Here's your offer. Here's your signing bonus. If you're here by July 7th, there's a spot for you in our analyst training program at Chemical Bank, which is now JP Morgan. So I had to think about it because, one was going to the river to go live in a tent and be a river guide, and the other was to go to New York City and put on a suit and be a banker. So I just kind of thought to myself, the river would always be there if this didn't work out, but somehow all of these dots got connected to get me to New York. So I went to New York and jumped into the investment banking thing. Did 2 years as an analyst at Chemical, and then a year at doing private equity for Lehman Brothers, which is no longer, obviously. And the internet happened. While I was there, a buddy from college said, hey, there's this thing called the internet. And, I played around with computers growing up in high school, and we had a thing called CompuServe, which was like a private network from this private company where you would dial up and you'd talk to people and do things inside their network. But the internet was open. So I convinced the group I was working with to get me a modem and to let me out of the firewall so I could download data from one of our vendors. But in fact, I would work all day and then stay until 3 a.m. just surfing these gray web pages with purple links that said nothing, listed like dog names and addresses of, all these other things. But was just fascinated by technology, this technology in particular, and the way it connected people, and realized that the future was going to be around this thing. I didn't know what it was going to look like exactly. And this was 1994, 95, I think. So after 3 years of banking, which was one of the best experiences that I've had because it gave me a huge foundation for building companies eventually, the financial piece of it and understanding how companies worked. I wrote a bunch of one-page business plans, handed them out to all the bankers. They said, this looks really interesting, but can you build it? And I couldn't. I was not a code writer at the time. I was a banker, and nobody would really believe a banker to go build something, and I couldn't do it myself anyway. So I decided that I needed to recreate myself. And the best way to do that was to go get an MBA. I thought that all the computers lived in California because that's what I heard about places like Mountain View and Sunnyvale, and they all sounded beautiful, but I'd never been to that part of the country. So I went to UCLA, to the Anderson School, to jump into technology any way I could and get a graduate degree. Volunteered with all the startups that I could find, just doing financial.
So you left investment banking and you just up and packed and moved pretty much across the country.
Yeah, my mom was like, asking me how this is going to work. So I applied to a couple schools, and I got into UCLA, and California seems like a cool place to be, and it's very different than Colgate, which is freezing cold and small, and UCLA was Los Angeles and warm. But I knew a lot of tech was going on in California, more so in Silicon Valley and up by Stanford, but I figured it was close enough. It was California. And once I got there, the school was pretty progressive, and they were using technology finally. Our class was the first class to be required to have a laptop, which was a $5,000 brick. That was crazy. But they wanted to incorporate it into the curriculum. And then I used the connections that the school had to go find some startups. There was one guy building this, trying to build a company called tickets.com because he owned the URL. Obviously we knew what he was doing. But e-commerce was something I was really interested in, like selling things on the internet and how that worked. And nothing existed. Like there was no Shopify. There was no, platforms to send email. It was just people writing code and building applications from scratch. And a lot of business plans floating around with some money, and they needed help executing. So I volunteered and just kind of cut my teeth understanding how small companies worked and loved it. It was amazing. Entrepreneurial, there was no rules. They were trying to figure things out as they go along. And that was very different than banking, which was here's your desk, here's your computer, here's how you do things. And stay within the lines. Doing tech in LA in the early 90s was not staying in the lines. It was just writing the lines. So really got excited about being in the technology space and realized that I love building things. Building was the most important thing that made me happy. And one of the most important things that I learned early in my career was it's really good to find out what you want to do with your career. It's also really good to find out what you don't want to do with your career. So while I didn't want to end up being a banker, I realized that And I thought about it in a positive way, not a negative way. It wasn't that I wasted 3 years. It was that I invested 3 years in understanding what wasn't for me. And the sooner that people can figure out what they love and what they don't love, the path becomes more clear for them later on. When I was in banking, I worked for a group that had money, and I worked for a group that needed money. And I worked for a group that got money from people that had it to people that needed it. But building and technology was on the third piece of that, which is what was people that needed money to go build stuff. So I felt like it was a good third, phase of my education in work, so to speak. So second year in grad school, we had to do a project, which is our thesis. I wrote a business plan that was bought with a team. I stayed on to build it, but it was a team of us built a business plan to do e-commerce for a media company in a new way, which wasn't new theoretically, but it was new online, which was what we dubbed virtual consignment, which was instead of buy, sell, ship, it was sell, buy, ship. And by that, it was a company who wanted to get an e-commerce, but they couldn't afford inventory. So we don't actually need the inventory. We just need a system to connect the inventory and the manufacturers with the buyers. And you have the buyers, and we'll just, instead of buying inventory and sitting on it, we'll just show the inventory like a catalog. They can come in and buy it, and then we would, in real time, buy it from the manufacturer and then drop ship it to them. I didn't know what I was doing at all. I never built this. The plan looked great. They hired me to build it, but it was one of those things that I had no experience with. So off I went, 28 years old. They came in and said, here, hire a team of 15 people, go build code that didn't exist, and have it ready in a year. So I took off and started going fast, and tried to get it going, and it was not going well. I hired a team. I went out and found technology to try to use. That technology was half-baked. The team wasn't happy because they didn't really know what they were doing, because they'd never done this before. I was a very inexperienced manager. I never managed people before. I had been an analyst and an associate in a bank. I didn't have anybody working for me. Probably made every mistake I could possibly make. We had a failed launch. We had to pull it back. It was not going well. And I remember while I was going through this hard time, a woman that I had gone to graduate school named Betsy, who is a wonderful woman, had gone off to work for a large consulting firm doing organizational change, behavior, whatever they call the practice. And we were having dinner or lunch or something, and I was describing this nightmare that was my life at this company, which I really wanted to do well at, and why I wasn't working. And she said, well, explain it to me. And I said, everybody's in different directions. No one's communicating. The code's not working. We got people in San Francisco, and we just can't get it done. And she said, well, describe your day to me, not their days. And I said, well, we have a meeting in the morning, and we all figure out what we're going to do that day, like a stand-up-ish thing. And then I go to my office, and I go work on my stuff, and I build the spreadsheets, and I call the vendors, and I do the deals and the contracts. And then, we meet up at the end of the day and see what we accomplished, and then we kind of do it all over again. And she said, well, how long has this been going on? I said, 3 or 4 months, from the beginning. And she's like, well, I think that's your problem. I said, what do you mean that's my problem? She's like, you've got a team, and that team is really, really important. And they're the ones that are going to do most of the work, not you. And what it sounds like to me is that you need to stop working and start managing. Because management is work. And it doesn't sound like work, walking around and checking in with people and making sure their things are going well with them in their work life and their personal lives. Making sure they have the tools, the resources, the time, making sure they're not burned out. That takes up hours and hours a day, and it's more important than building your spreadsheets or doing your contracts or talking to customers. Because eventually, to scale a business and to grow, you're going to have to trust the team and also give them the resources and the freedom to be themselves. And that's not happening right now. Right now, they feel like they're being assigned tasks and you're not checking in. So it was great advice. So things turned around a little bit.
Why do you think you took her advice?
I mean, honestly, sometimes when you get, I'm I wouldn't say stubborn, but I'm kind of, I try to stay true to my beliefs and think that if it's not going well, I can figure it out. But at that moment, I, one, trusted her because I respect her a lot. But two, I was kind of at the end of my rope. Mm-hmm. Like I really thought this thing was about to fail completely and that I was a failure. And being, as people know, a sole founder, so to speak, of a company within a company is very lonely.
Yeah.
You don't have somebody else sitting next to you as a co-founder saying, what's going on? What are we doing wrong? And bounce ideas off of each other. This was just me trying to be the captain of a ship that was sinking. And I could either watch it sink and go down with it, or I could ask for a lifeline or a life raft, whatever you want to call it. And she was that for me at that time. So it really helped. And that thing, I still tell people that I mentor to this day that when you're a startup and everybody heads down, it's great. But eventually, as you start to bring on team members, your day is going to change from being the head salesperson, the CTO, the head of marketing, the CFO, all at once. Employee number one starts a new chapter where you've got to spend time with that person, not just on what they're doing in the work, but as a member of the team to begin to build a culture and to understand that they need management, not just direction. Yeah, you're right. I took her advice because I was very sideways, and I'm very glad I did.
There have been CEOs that I've even worked with where they just can't seem to get out of their way. What would be your advice to somebody who is either working with them or trying to coach them in a way that can get them to shift their perspective away from doing work and actually managing the team?
Well, at the beginning of our conversation, I talked about this yo-yo thing that my mom sent to me. And that had been part of my philosophy in life for a long time, which was you're on your own, you do things yourself, you do them exceptionally well, and if they're not working, you just grind harder to figure it out. I learned the hard way during that experience we just spoke about that doesn't always work.
Yeah.
So when companies are, so two things. One, CEOs that understand that they need to be flexible and change come from two different places. The first time, and they're inexperienced CEOs, or they're experienced CEOs that have had an experience like I had that learned from it. And now the second time, they're going to do things differently. But I think that when companies are built, it's always extremely important to have a team both above and below the CEO level. So mentors, investors, advisors are critical to the success of most companies, as well as great employees and culture and everything else. And it's impossible for a CEO, it's very rare for a CEO to be very successful in building a large business, or any business for that matter, without having help and guidance from both an objective place and a subjective place. Objective meaning if there's somebody you talk to that has no relationship with your company, like this woman that I spoke with, that just said, describe how it's going and I can give you feedback about the world and how I see things in my world, and maybe you can glean something from that. Subjective advice comes from advisors, formal advisors and investors who are asking you what's going on. And if you're honest and truthful with them, which sometimes CEOs aren't because they don't want to show that they're not performing, we'll say, well, we've got 30 other companies that have gone through things like this. you should go talk to one of those CEOs that have been through it. Or here's what had happened in the past, and here are the landmines that we discovered that you cannot step on. So for CEOs of large and small businesses, making sure that you spend time listening to the advice of people both with a vested interest in your company and people that don't is critically important. It's hard because there are egos, there are energies of people who think that they're going to rule the world. Not everybody's Elon Musk, not everybody's Mark Zuckerberg, but, and those guys are great, but I'm sure even behind the scenes, though, they might be seen as sort of the magical leaders of their companies that, conjure these things out of nowhere. They probably had some folks that they confided in and talked to, which gave them some good advice along the way to make sure that they don't keep hitting their head against the wall.
Yeah.
I mean, what's that saying? The definition of insanity is expecting that the same outcome
or a different outcome.
With the same. Exactly.
Yeah. There's a key piece that you talked about, which is, it sounds like being surrounded by people who can help support the path that you're on, both in business and life, is incredibly important. And who did you have in your corner? Like, what was your circle like as you were starting this path on entrepreneurship and moving forward? Because after you're off work, like, who are the people that you were turning to that really gave you that sense of, outlet where you could have somebody you could talk to about? Because I do agree with you. I think entrepreneurship is hard. There's a lot of emotional highs and a lot of emotional lows.
Yeah. Well, I'd probably be the first to admit that I wasn't the best at asking for help. I think that, some people will use their family, parents. I didn't have that really as a resource for me. And running a company when you're very young is doubly hard. It's hard anytime. You could be 60 and running a company. It's hard. But at least as you get a bit older, you've got more experience to draw on when you see things pop up. I think that when I was starting out, the investors helped me a lot, and I was a sponge. I kind of listened and learned from their experiences because they've got a portfolio of companies going through similar things, and they have the ability to share that with you. When I was running, I guess the company after I left Los Angeles, because I'd done that startup I talked about after graduate school. I'd done another e-commerce startup that did okay, not great, in e-commerce. And then it was leaving LA, coming to Colorado, and met a woman through my banking relationships that was starting something. This guy put us together in Georgia, of all places, and said, you should meet because she's building this thing and she needs some help building this thing. And the company was called Daily Candy. And what was supposed to be 3 months of consulting turned into 9 years. At the beginning, we were all kind of doing the startup thing, but I'd already been through two. So I knew some things, a couple years older, but I had also gone through that hard experience failing with my management skills. So I had that to draw on a little bit. But after a couple of years, we took on an investor, a guy named Bob Pittman. Bob Pittman was the founder of MTV. He had run Six Flags, Century 21 at some point, if I believe I'm correct. Was a very seasoned entrepreneur, veteran. And we didn't need the money when we brought him on, but we needed help and advice. And he had a small investment company. And, those meetings that we had, because he was a pretty hands-on guy, because he was an operator, were extremely helpful for me. We didn't always see eye to eye in everything, and I knew my business better than I thought he did, but he had tons of experience running these large companies, building huge brands and businesses. And that was really the outlet and the group that I leaned on my first kind of really scaled business that turned into a good success. And I think that's sort of the pay it forward kind of mentality. Yes, he had an investment in the company, so he had an interest in making it do well financially. But hopefully he saw us as a group that he could share his experiences with and teach a little bit, and help us grow as young entrepreneurs trying to build something in a very fast moving world. I really think that when people surrender to the idea that they can't know everything, do everything, and they're not always right, which for entrepreneurs sometimes is hard, and they actually look around to seek out that help, they can find it, and it comes in a variety of places.
Yeah, I would say that I got stuck in that cycle a little bit too when I first started my company, because I just thought, well, I'm in this space of marketing. I know best. All of my ideas are going to work. But I loved that my humility really kicked in, because I tried a lot of different things and had to fail and had a ton of missteps. Luckily, they weren't ever financially, but just learnings. And the more that I learned about just the business side of things, I also learned a ton about myself. The more I learned about myself, I leaned on like the self-improvement, personal growth stuff. And I actually think a lot of that then bled over into my business, and my business was like, it thrived because I was a better person. And
For sure.
I think I lost my grandpa, who was like a huge figure in my life in 2020. And that was like a huge path of going into self-development for me. And then the next year, my business grew like 300%, which I don't think it was a coincidence. I think it was because I learned so much about myself and just had to learn about the things like what triggers you, why do you communicate the way that you do, how does that affect, self-awareness, right?
Yeah.
Internally and externally. And for you, like, did that play a role into like your journey at all? Like kind of looking inward? Because I think your mom's yo-yo perspective kind of seemed like it stuck with you, but did you ever get to a point where you let it go and just realize like, hey,
Sure.
I can go, fast alone, but if I want to go far, I have to like lean on people and like be okay with not just being on my own.
Yeah. I think that it's hard to shake your origin story, and everybody's affected by their circumstance and how they're brought up, and early things that affect them deeply early. I want to be completely honest with you. I don't think I've ever abandoned that to some extent, but I've learned to manage it a little bit better and work with it. There are things that I will hopefully, or not hopefully, but there are things that I will hopefully shake that will allow me to continue to grow as a person. And there's things that I think that will have difficulty shaking. I'm sure my family will appreciate that as I, continue to go along, my path. But some of the traits that a lot of people might see as negative are the traits that sometimes make startups succeed. People that can't make decisions because they want to please everybody. They want to build by consensus. Those don't lend themselves to building great things or building things quickly. I'm not sure which mentor or advisor of mine said this to me, but I now share with other people. a long time ago, they said, have you made the decision on whatever yet? And I said, no. They said, well, we've been thinking about it for a couple of weeks. I was like, yeah, but I'm still working on the analysis or whatever. This is pretty early in my career. And they said, so if you were going to give it a probability of success, what would it be? And I said, well, it's definitely not 100% because nothing is. And they said, is it 20%? I'm like, no, it's higher than that. And they said, 50? I said, no. And I said, how about 75? I was like, yeah, I'm 75% sure this is going to happen or this is going to work. And they said, great. If you're 75% sure of something, then just do it and make the last 25% happen, because you're never going to be 100%.
Yeah.
And you're going to get paralyzed. And paralysis in startups, because they can't make a decision, kill them faster than anything else.
Yeah.
So, you know, the ability to turn what some, like I said, people would think are flaws or tendencies about your character into strengths is important. So the things I got from Yo-Yo or the things I got from other areas of my life, you know, not having a father, you know, to lean on for experience or whatever, kind of forced me into just doing things a little bit hard and fast and trying to make it all work. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but.
No, you did. I would agree with that, because I think one of my biggest flaws is impatience. And I think that in the business world, it works really well to an extent, because I'm just not the kind of person who can sit in a meeting without a purpose.
Sure.
And that gives me a lot of like the relentless pursuit of trying to figure something out to see if it's going to work. And so it's sort of, I take on more of that 95% execution, maybe 5% thinking. Because you can think all day, you can come up with great ideas, but the market's still going to tell you if you're interested in what you have. In my 20s, Pete, I defined success based on how quickly I could climb the corporate ladder.
I remember when you were working with, you know, with me, like I remember you had a plan.
Yeah. And I also attached my income to that, but that's completely shifted for me in terms of how I define success.
Yeah.
I'm curious how you define success.
You know, as a builder of things, and hopefully a advisor or mentor to other people, you know, if I can, you know, make their experience better and teach them something that then they can teach to somebody else, then that's a successful mentor. I think that from on the on the success side, obviously outside of my, you know, having a good family life, making sure that, I'm spending the time, with them, committing to them, and enjoying that aspect of my life. Success is defined through failure and actually accomplishing things. Accomplishing things, yes, building something that works, that makes people's lives better, easier, happier, to me is probably one of the most important things. Financially, that's never really been the success, other than the fact that earlier in my career, I would define my success as if I could get my investors a return. It wasn't necessarily a personal thing, but it was the minute, not until my third company did we ever really have money, like, given to us. And I thought it was my mission in life to make sure that I didn't lose it and to give it back and give back more of that to the people that gave it to me. So that was one of the ways I defined success. I don't think companies failing, anybody would think is a good thing, but sometimes things change. The market changes, a rule changes, the environment changes, and there are things that are actually outside of your control. But One of the things that I remember also very clearly from one of my early investors or advisors, actually it was an investor, and it was when we were taking our first real institutional money in one of my companies. I was very nervous because it was a real check and I'd never done that kind of a check before. And I said to them, what happens if it doesn't work out? And they said, well, let's not think that way, because they're always going to encourage me. But second, they said, we believe in you. And whether or not we can make this idea work together, like we don't know, but we believe in you to figure it out and wrestle this thing to the ground. And they said, we invest in a lot of companies, so we're professionals. We understand that not everything's going to work. But the thing that I learned from that group was this. They said that we invest in people, not in companies. And I mentioned this before, but by that, they said, we have a portfolio of people. And they said, we'll invest in an entrepreneur, and it might work, it might not. What we don't want to have happen is to not get an opportunity to invest in that entrepreneur again. Because we believe at some point they're going to be successful and it's going to be big. It might not be the first thing or the second, but maybe it's the third. And maybe it's not the third, it's the fourth. But if we gave up on everybody after their first failure, we wouldn't have a business. Because we know that if we look at the return on investment from that person, not from the company, over the course of 1, 2, 3, or 4 companies, it's going to be positive. And you can't get that kind of return if you're one and done. And that thing made me actually feel more confident in doing what I was doing and taking risks, knowing that a failure is not going to blackball me for the rest of my life. If I worked hard, if I did everything the best of my ability, and something happened out of my control or whatever, professionals understand that happens all the time.
Yeah.
And that they will keep me around waiting for my next idea, or if they have an idea that needs execution that they know I can execute for them, then they'll hand it over.
Yeah.
So that was one of the things that came up that I think people should understand, that if you're honest and you work hard and you give everything your all, and you show that just because you strike out doesn't mean you don't get another time at the plate.
When you have hit those emotional lows, like the failures you're talking about, how have you bounced back from them?
I think for me, it was finding some things that would give me small wins, victories. And that wasn't going out and starting another company and making another company a victory. It was doing things that I believed I was good at. And it could be, jumping on my bike and riding 50 miles. It could be building a spreadsheet for a friend who is starting a business that I was good at. It could be making dinner that I really liked.
Yeah.
This is not necessarily business related, but your confidence is shot.
Yeah.
If you lose people money or the money isn't returned right away or it changes hands, you feel like a failure, and I had. But I knew I had some core skills that were valuable, that would be useful to my family or to people around me. And while I wasn't going to go out and go raise money and start something else the next day, it was maybe do a little consulting and have something work, or help someone out with a problem that they're having, or go help my neighbor or my friend, fix his car.
Yeah.
Things that are outside of my normal career path. Because I think that if people get down, the fastest way for them to get back up is not to take a big bite at something.
Yeah.
It's just to take little tiny bites and be successful at those. And that kind of regains your faith in yourself, and your confidence to be able to do the things that you once had done really well that might have not worked out.
Yeah.
It's kind of like a runner or any sort of athlete. they're going to have a good day and they're going to have a bad day.
Right.
And if they have a bad day and say, now I'm slow, now I'm not as skilled, now I struck out, now I dropped a catch or missed a field goal, and they don't bounce back, they don't go out there and forget it. They go out there and work a little bit and try to get a small win back and creep back up, and it helps them out.
Yeah. You said something that sort of was like a reoccurring theme. And I think the quote is, oh my gosh, I could be wrong. I think it's by Gandhi, where he says, you find yourself when you lose yourself in the service of others.
Yeah.
And something that you said a lot was defining success by being able to provide somebody with advice that they could then hand down to somebody else. And as you're building yourself up from a big failure, helping somebody with their car, cooking dinner for yourself and your family. I like the service aspect of it because I do think as humans, that's a connection point for us, is when we feel like we can be of service to somebody. And even if it's not huge,
sure,
it provides a sense of gratification.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that, as I've learned, through my own work, doing things for others is sort of a theme.
Mm-hmm.
That's good and bad to some extent, because you always have to do some things for yourself.
Yeah.
I think my family would understand that comment.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes you do a little bit too much, and you need to allow people to do things their own way. And I'm definitely not the best at that all the time. And that happens in business also, because probably one of my first company, when I was giving direction, it was do it this way. And, as you learn and get more experience, you realize that providing service for others is not just you doing things for them, but allowing them to do things for themselves underneath the umbrella of whatever you guys are working on. They then grow and learn and can develop, rather than giving them very clear instructions about,
this is the blueprint.
This is the blueprint. You stamp this and you put it there, and you do that 100 times a day and you're done. And one of the other, things that I've talked to people about as they were figuring out how to become managers, when they didn't necessarily trust, or not trust, but didn't have confidence in some people or team because they were inexperienced. I just said, and maybe this is wrong, but I think I heard this correctly once. The military has a process for accomplishing things. They are very clear about three things when they're looking at their structure for how they do things. They clearly define the goal and make sure that everybody understands what they want to accomplish. They clearly define the time frame in which that goal needs to be completed. And the third is they provide all the resources necessary to accomplish that goal. But that's it. There's no direction. There's no blueprint on how to go. So if you were thinking about something as simple as like getting up a hill, and you had to go 100 miles to get to the top of Pikes Peak from here or whatever, they'd say, what's the goal? Well, we need to get to the top of Pikes Peak. When do we have to be there? You've got to be there in 2 days or 3 days or whatever. And they said, well, do you have everything you need to accomplish that goal? Backpacks, food, water, whatever it is. And they said, great. I'm not going to tell you how to get there or how to behave on the way, or like what the process is. So I'll see you there in 3 days.
Yeah.
And then they leave it to the team to figure out on their own how to put all those pieces together. So I think a lot of companies, and I'm getting a little bit off topic on this though, those three things aren't necessarily defined clearly.
I would agree.
Or at least, even if they are, they're not communicated to the entire group, so everybody's on the same page. And it's a little bit restrictive because things will come up. But if you allow the team to figure those things out on their own, because nothing's changed. They still
Yeah.
need to go do this thing. They still need to be there then. And they're not always going to be successful. And do they have all the things that they need to do it?
Yeah.
So, I suggest that to people when you're setting out to build something or
Yeah.
a team or a company. If you can't define those three things or haven't, take a step back, do it.
Yeah.
And I think the prospects for success will be much higher.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that. I also saw a parallel with that in business, and also like even my relationship with my husband. We're very different people, but we have the same vision and goals of what we want in life, but allow each other the independence and like to pursue it how
Sure.
we want, because we're just different. But we know we're trying to get to the same point.
Yeah.
And in business, I agree with you. I think that is hugely missing from companies who might be struggling to grow, or even just feel like they're thriving, is when they don't have the goals established, a timeline tied to that, and given the right resources to achieve it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that happens, maybe in phase 2 or phase 3 of companies. At the beginning, it's sort of spaghetti at the wall time. Like, we don't know what the product market fit's going to be. We have to try some things and fail. So the goal is really I guess there is a goal. The goal is to figure out what you actually want to do.
Yeah.
The goal is to figure out what the goal is.
Yeah.
Which is important.
Yeah.
And the communication of that goal and all the other pieces are important too, because as companies grow from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 employees, there's a couple of different rules. One of my rules is the lunch rule. The lunch rule is when there's one person, you eat lunch by yourself. If there's 2 people, you have lunch together.
Yeah.
If there's 3 people, you have lunch together.
Yeah.
But when there's 4 people and your team size grows to 4 and people pair off and go to lunch in 2 different directions, that's the moment that communication breaks down.
Yeah.
It doesn't fail. It might not break down. But when you're eating lunch with each other every day and you're always spending all the time together, there's not 2 separate conversations happening. And of course, it's a natural evolution. It's going to happen. So I'm not saying that you should force everybody to have lunch together every day.
Yeah.
It's just be mindful that there could very subtly become communication gaps.
Yeah.
Because of literally the growth.
Yeah.
And that will get amplified when you go from 4 to 8 to 16 to 32.
Yeah.
For CEOs or managers of companies, if you ever get to the point where you can't talk to everybody in your company every day, then it's a new phase of your company. If you ever get to the point that you don't know everybody's names,
Yeah.
because you're just growing, it's a new phase of your company. And of course, if you've got hundreds or thousands of employees, it'd be impossible unless you've got a photographic memory. But recognizing those things and realize that your management has to change in order to adjust with the growth of your business is super important.
Yeah.
Making sure that all the founders are aligned.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean that alignment can't change, or people's personal goals change over time. But if you have an early company, you probably know this a lot, founder issues kill a lot of companies early because they can't agree on the direction, the goal, the method, the timing, all that kind of stuff. And I think a lot of VCs jump in early and fix those right away because the idea could be good and the team could be good.
Yeah.
But if the founders just can't get on the same page for whatever reason, they'll be like, okay, let's take care of you somewhere else.
Yeah.
Rather than just having them end up, beating each other up and not having it work.
If you were to just give listeners one piece of advice, what would that piece of advice be?
Don't be afraid to start. What I mean by not being afraid to start is finding all the reasons why you shouldn't do something and convincing yourself that it's impossible. I think it's really important to identify all the hard things that you might have to accomplish to build a company or to do anything. But not taking that first step, trusting the 75% rule. Um, those are the things that get you one step down the path, and then it's just trying to figure out, each next step.
Yeah.
Personally too, when you are needing help or at a low point or things are not working, taking that first step to work on yourself, to communicate with someone else, ask for help,
Yeah.
which is hard for a lot of entrepreneurs, is really, really important. And I think when I was talking about one of my companies, it's funny, I haven't thought about this in a while, but I have all these little analogies that I hold on to now that I probably have told people, and they said, yeah, you've told us that before. One of the companies along the lines of just start, that I was working with the investors or the advisor group, was asking me to build something. I was telling them I want to build something. And I was telling them all the reasons why it was going to be hard and cost money. And they said, and this was a wonderful man, who was a salesperson by nature. And he said this to me. He's like, I'm going to tell you the man in the moon speech. And if Perry's listening to this, I'm sure he's heard all of these things a million times. But the man in the moon speech. He said in the 60s, Kennedy got up on the podium and said, in a decade, we're going to put a man on the moon. And then he went on the whole speech about after, I don't know if it was Armstrong or the first astronauts orbited the Earth. But in 10 years, we're putting a man on the moon, literally standing on the moon. Speech ended, got back in his limo, went back to the White House, and all the advisors came rushing in. Maybe the guy telling me the story is embellishing. I don't know if this actually happened or not, but in my mind, it happened. And the president was sitting behind the desk in the Oval Office, and then one advisor said, there's no way we're getting to the moon. Another advisor says, it's impossible. 10 years is too short. We don't, whatever. And everybody was super negative because he had gone off script and just said, we're going to the moon in 10 years, and that's what the country's going to do. And Kennedy looks at the advisors and he says, okay, so tell me all the reasons why we can't go to the moon. He's like, well, we don't have a propulsion system. It's like, okay. It's like, we don't have spacesuits. Okay. We don't have the computers, the technology to navigate. Okay. We don't have the communications. Okay. We don't have the list went on and on. So Kennedy quietly looked at all of those advisors and said, if we develop the propulsion system, if we build the spacesuit, if we figure out the communications, if we understand what they need to eat in space, get a lander, build all those things, can we go to the moon? And they said, well, yeah, if we figure all that stuff out, of course we can get to the moon. He's like, okay, let's get started. So, you're never going to know everything. But having the confidence in yourself that you'll be able to figure it out is really, really important. And the most important part is just to take the first step.